Coming up on today's show, how can I tell who paid me with only one address? I sit down with Dan of ZeroBlock and Nick of Bitwall to talk about their functional paywall and the first full rollout coming soon. New compliance requirements may demand refundable Bitcoin transactions. Does this break the bank? Looking forward to the Canadian Bitcoin Embassy. InstaWallet customer James fills me in on the aftermath of the InstaWallet debacle. Stephanie was also an InstaWallet user. She helps finish the story. All this and more on today's episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show focused on the ideas, projects, and people building the new digital economy and the future of money. We've turned the Let's Talk Bitcoin subreddit into a place for listeners to do some of the prep work for us by submitting topics, questions, or comments. We're going to try and use this as much as possible, and submissions with more upvotes from other listeners will make it onto the show much faster than sending an email. To participate, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/reddit. That's REDDIT. Or visit the Let's Talk Bitcoin, all one word, subreddit. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to talk about complicated topics in understandable terms. Joining me in our twice-weekly search for clarity, Andreas M. Antonopoulos is an expert in distributed systems and decentralized networks.
Hello.
Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host.
Hi there.
We received a piece of listener mail. It says this: I love your show. I haven't listened to all of them, so perhaps you've already discussed this, but my question is, I don't understand how you can tell who has made a payment to you if you publish a Bitcoin address and use it for all incoming sales /tips /donations or whatever. If I set up a website and post a Bitcoin address for people to pay me and several other people make purchases, how can I tell them apart and know who did and who didn't pay? This is something that we came up against pretty early in trying to figure out how we wanted to handle tips on the show, and after some initial experiments using, first we just had a general address, then we just had addresses that were specific. We would basically generate a new Bitcoin address and a new Litecoin address for every time we put out a piece of content. Basically, you can't tell on a person-to-person basis which donation goes to which person unless they specifically contact you to tell you.
Well, even if they contact you to tell you, they could be lying. If you get a tip, you can tell where the tip came from as far as which Bitcoin address it came from. However, you don't know who as a person is attached to that Bitcoin address unless maybe they've published it publicly or something like that, but that's pretty rare. So yeah, like you said, Adam, you really can't tell. And even if somebody did say, hey, I sent you a tip at 12:02 p.m. and this was how much I sent you, they could just be looking at the blockchain and seeing that information because that's public. You don't really have any way to actually verify that they were the one who sent that tip. It would become a problem if you were, for instance, trying to sell a product and you wanted to be able to verify that a certain person made a specific payment to an address, which is why when people sell things, typically what they do is generate a new address for each customer in each sale so that they know that the payment is coming from a specific customer because they're the only one who has that address to pay to.
And there's three ways to really do that. The first way is to pre-generate a whole bunch of addresses and store both the public and private key somewhere, put them in a database, and then issue one for every transaction or for every sale or for every piece of content you want to sell. That's really cumbersome because then you have to track all of these private keys. A slightly better way is to use a Type 2 deterministic wallet, such as the one in Electrum with a master public key. And then essentially you have one private key, and then you generate a whole bunch of addresses from the public key. And then you can unlock those with a single private key. It makes the management a bit easier and more predictable. The third approach would be a new one, which is to use BIP32 hierarchical deterministic wallets. And there you can have on your web server, for example, a public extended key that generates infinite numbers of public keys, all of which are related to a single set of private keys that you can generate on a separate machine. So there's ways around this, but essentially the primary practice is to assign a unique address, not just to every piece of content, but potentially to every transaction, and then track that, either by keeping some metadata in a database or by generating in a deterministic fashion, so that when the payment comes in, you can then say, okay, I got this payment on this address, and because I only gave this address for this piece of content and user, I know who it was from.
So basically, there are a lot of approaches you can take to it, but the more control you want to have and the more you want to be able to tell who is sending what, basically it gets a little bit more complicated as you go. But Andreas, when we have hierarchical deterministic wallets as something that is kind of standard in wallet applications, this should become a kind of easier problem, right?
It becomes a lot easier because you can essentially put only a public key on the web server, not risking any of your private keys. However, what's difficult is trickling back the payments from the temporary addresses to more permanent storage. So you have to do some kind of payment processing. But yes, it's a lot easier than trying to generate and keep track of multiple private keys, where if you had a database loss or crash and you lose those keys, there's no way to regenerate them. And at that point, you've lost the payments that went to them. So there's a very big risk there, too. Hierarchical deterministic wallets will make this a lot easier.
So we had a little back and forth with this listener who asked that question, which is a great question I think a lot of people wonder about, by the way. His next question, sort of to follow up on that, was, okay, so how do you generate new addresses for each transaction? It seems kind of cumbersome to do that. And Andreas, you answered that question very nicely. But if you're a merchant and you want to easily, accept Bitcoin for payment for your products that you're selling online, there are a few services that have, you can sign up with them as a merchant, and then they have an API which you can add to your website that automatically does that for you, so that when the customer checks out, they're taken to a page where they're shown a Bitcoin address that is unique to them, and it's different for every customer and every order. And then the payment system knows that once Bitcoin comes into that address, it has to be from that customer because they're the only one who saw it. So there's no need to do that manually. There's some services that do that, and two of them are BitPay and Payzius, and there's other ones too coming out all the time.
Yeah, I would add to that Coinbase, who also offer a merchant service, BIPS, which is a European service for those who don't have US bank account, BIPS, and also blockchain.info has an extensive API that can do aliasing and forwarding and be used in such a fashion. So there's a range of options depending on how much control you want and also how much you want done for you.
His very last question was, he basically saw something in Wired magazine that freaked him out about smartphones. And that was this program that essentially sends all of the keystrokes that happen on smartphones to some place in the ether, and it can't be turned off. And so he saw a video about this and he was like, well, I don't really like this so much. I think I'm kind of freaked out and I don't want to use a smartphone. So he was wondering if there's any way to use Bitcoin on a dumb phone or a conventional cell phone, like a little flip phone. There is a way actually to send or receive Bitcoins by SMS, which is Coinapult. And if you go to coinapult.com, you can find out how to do that. You can send Bitcoin to a phone number or a email address that way.
Also, if that phone has a browser of any kind, both Coinbase and BitPay have web accessible and even mini mobile browser accessible payment screens where you can generate invoices or payment requests for people to pay you. And I've seen that in use, for example, in a restaurant. But so if you had a dumb phone, you could use a browser to access those services.
Last week, I spoke with Pele Brandgaard of Kapochi Wallet. So if you're outside the United States, that's a system that works quite well on dumb phones.
Was this the one that was tied to M-Pesa?
Yes, this is the one that integrates with M-Pesa, but it's not actually tied to M-Pesa. That's just one of the connections into and out of it. Basically, they hide almost all of the complexity from the users and instead just make it so that the interface looks very similar to M-Pesa, and you can receive to your phone number and send to your to other people's phone numbers. And Bitcoin addresses are essentially aliased to those phone numbers. This morning, I'm joined by Dan Held from ZeroBlock and Nick Meliones from the Bitwall project. Dan, can you tell us a little bit about ZeroBlock?
ZeroBlock is basically a newswire service. Right now, we have an iOS app. It has gotten some pretty good traction with consumers, and we're going to take that, and we are almost done with a website that has a dashboard-style interface. In addition to that, we're also looking at Android. So we're looking at being the first cross-platform news service for mobile and the web.
So now the reason why we're talking about that today, and the app as it stands is great. I've tried it myself and used it, and if I were more of an app person, then again, it'd be something I'd be using on a regular basis. But the reason why we're talking about this today, actually, Nick, has to do with your project. Nick, you and I met at Bitcoin 2013, and I kind of, ambushed you talking about how Bitcoin was going to be revolutionary for monetary transactions and kind of the way we do business on the web. You kind of took that concept and ran with it. Can you tell us a little bit about your Bitwall project?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I should start off, first of all, by thanking you for the discussion involving microtransactions, because that was definitely very formative in terms of my understanding of the power for Bitcoin in terms of what it can do for microtransactions. And yeah, so we ran at the Bitcoin conference. We won the Bitcoin conference hackathon with Bitwall. And Bitwall is a micropayment platform for digital publishers. So anyone who's monetizing content online, we're building a platform that allows them to work with our widget and ultimately an API and start accepting micropayments for their content. And so one of the reasons why we're excited about this platform, but also really enthusiastic about working with Dan and his team, is that with current payment products, the transaction fees are pretty high, and a lot of times prohibitively high, given the size of the transaction for content that you could sell. But with Bitwall, we're able to knock the transaction fees much lower and really enable smaller transactions for this digital content.
So what is Bitwall? You said that it's a paywall application. How does that work, and how is it leveraging Bitcoin to make it work?
If you're going to be on ZeroBlock's web platform, for instance, and ZeroBlock being the first platform that we're going to be working with, when you go to ZeroBlock, as you're consuming content, as you click on an article or click on content to consume, we can help monetize each piece of content. And so essentially it can be one-click payments for that content. And with Bitcoin, with the transaction fees being as low as 0.0005 Bitcoin, there's an opportunity to really power these low transactions of such a small amount that wouldn't even be possible previously.
Dan, why is this something that's appealing to you? I'm sure that you looked at other models when you're doing what you're doing. Why is this the way that you've gone?
I have to admit, I listened to your podcast about content monetization, and really my whole life I've kind of been intrigued with micropayments. Why shouldn't I just pay 1 cent when I read an article or pay 1 cent when I watch a YouTube video? It's something that I've kind of been enthralled with. And whenever I saw Nick won the hackathon, I shot him an email and I was like, hey, we're a news aggregator. I think that your concept would definitely work on our platform. We're just excited. It's a pretty new thing in the area of news, and, yet New York Times and Wall Street Journal having issues with having these very large paywalls. And so we're hoping to actually create a functional paywall that doesn't have 90% of the users drop off afterwards.
So how does this change that? What is it that's happening differently than a paywall in another circumstance here?
So me and Nick have pondered this question quite a bit. How do we create a frictionless environment for our consumers? So we've come up with a few different things. For instance, these are going to be very, very small micropayments. We're going to create a buffer account. So when a user signs up, they get $2 free, something like that. And in addition, I read this once where someone came up with an idea that either the consumer pays for the content or the consumer broadcasts it on their social networks. So if you broadcast the article on your social networks, you get like a day free. So basically the content either gets propagated or monetized.
Huh. That's a really interesting approach to it. So now, one of the things about paywalls is that you need to have original content behind them. At least that was my assumption. Are you generating original content? What exactly are you charging for with your service?
As everyone has seen with Pulse, people are really moving towards news aggregators. And what we plan on doing is sharing 80% of the revenue with the original content creators. So basically, we're going to create a platform that's able to plug in news sources. So these news sources, originally, the only way they could monetize content was either doing a paywall or advertising. Now you can just plug into an existing news aggregator and instantly monetize your content, and you don't have to worry about the back end with Bitwall or anything like that. We've already done all that.
Yeah, and Adam, one thing I'd like to touch on, going back to the concept of comparing this to traditional paywalls. With a traditional paywall, if you're going to dive directly into the subscription model, there is a pretty high attrition rate. There's been some cases where you've seen up to about 70% attrition in terms of consumers as soon as they hit that paywall. And so by offering a more dynamic pricing model, enabling people to not necessarily buy a subscription right off the bat, but give them a chance to consume content, pay for the content they're consuming, or as Dan put it, have an opportunity to post about it on Twitter and propagate it through social media. It gives these different ways for consumers to be engaging in the content and not necessarily have to commit to a full subscription at the minute.
So one of the issues that's been kind of a hot topic in the Bitcoin community is this idea of dust transactions. Transactions that are so small that they essentially don't justify the fee that has to be paid for them. Now, you mentioned paying 1 cent per article or per piece of content. And I think that, yeah, you're right. That's really where the compelling stories are, because at that low price, I mean, there's just no reason not to, unless you absolutely have no resources whatsoever. If you value it in the slightest, that is literally the smallest amount of value that you can possibly send to it. And so I think that that's something that a larger number of people will find more appealing. But the flip side of that is that right now, if you look at the transaction fee, it's about 6 cents per transaction. Do people have accounts with Bitwall where they deposit a certain amount of money and then you handle those transactions off the blockchain and then only do like a reckoning every day? Or is every transaction, every page that you're viewing a separate transaction that incurs its own fee?
We are working out the internal logistics of that right now, but we do intend to make use of the off-blockchain transactions, with that being the most viable option there.
So what's the pricing model then? Can you share that with me? Or is this something where you guys are still trying to figure out what the formula should look like? Where are you right now with this?
Yeah, so we're still working on a lot of logistics of that one. But in terms of the off-blockchain transactions, that was something where as soon as that became readily available through the protocol, obviously something that we're very excited about, it definitely gives us a better venue and a better platform to be authorizing transactions as low as 1 cent. Because like you said, for each time you broadcast the blockchain, with the transaction fee being around 5 or 6 cents, that does put a lower bound in terms of what the transaction fees can be. But now with the off-blockchain transactions, that opens up a whole new world of opportunities in terms of how low we can drive the transactions. Long story short, though, we are still working out the logistics of all that.
So, Dan, you mentioned that 80% of the money that you're raising through the use of this paywall system is actually going to go to the original content creator, whereas what you're running is an aggregation. You essentially are a curator, right? You take streams of information and new articles coming from around the web, and you combine them into one site or service that then essentially makes it so that can be the one space you go. Now, that's not an uncommon model, but I think it is uncommon to take that model and to send most of your revenue to the people who are actually creating that original content. How did you decide to do that?
First, I looked at existing models. There was Pulse and Readability. Readability really took the model to a direction that I liked. What they did is they charged a subscriber amount per month, and it was like $3 or $4. And what they did is they took that revenue and then put it in a segregated account for all of the original content publishers. By segregating 80% of the funds that are generated through this paywall, we basically set that aside for original content publishers so that may allay any sort of concerns that we're generating revenue off of their content. This basically provides a platform for them to get that revenue, but also allow the consumer to take in different feeds of content.
So what are you doing with the remaining 20%?
Well, we've been playing around with the idea of taking that 20% and creating a new meetup in San Francisco. Right now there's a meetup with TradeHill, and we love the TradeHill meetups. Those guys are great. Everyone there, you got the Coinbase guys there, Ripple there. It's a ton of fun. But it is a little bit exclusive. You've got all these very big Bitcoiners, but you don't necessarily have new people coming in. So we'd like to take that 20% and start a new meetup kind of for people that are new to Bitcoin and introduce new people to Bitcoin.
Okay. So is there any revenue model that is actually generating money for ZeroBlock?
We've been working on the back end, taking this news feed, and what we've been doing is working with, I can't disclose the name of the company, but we are going to perform sentiment analysis, and we are going to sell this data feed to trading platforms. And we have, there's one called RTBTC that we've been in talks with for the last couple months. They might be one of the first ones to be using that feed.
That's a really interesting model. So even though this is an application that is being provided to consumers, the only compensation that's being derived from the actual consumers is going to the creators or going to help incentivize new users essentially into the Bitcoin space, albeit locally. I mean, the San Francisco thing obviously is only local, but that, I mean, and so then your monetization platform comes entirely from sponsors on the other side of it who are using your data feed. Now, where are you getting this sentiment data?
What we do is we have collated, I think it's around 20,000 articles now since early April. And we take those, we scrape the text out of it, and then we send that to our server. And the server performs sentiment analysis with NLP, natural language processing. and then returns that as a number. So it could be positive or negative number based on the verbiage inside of each sentence. And we take that feed and we send it unprocessed to the trading platform. That way, the trading platform can take that positive or negative sentiment, and you can take that number and then weight it however you like. Because if we did the weighting customized on our end, basically everyone would see the same weighting. You might value something such as a 51% attack, or MTGOX is down, or MTGOX has liquidity problems. Each one of those has a different meaning to different people. And so we're thinking about letting the trading platforms really weight those values.
That's a really interesting approach to it. If somebody wants to download the ZeroBlock application or visit the ZeroBlock website, what's the process for doing that?
Yeah, well, check us out in the App Store, ZeroBlock. Check us out online, zeroblock.com. Within the next week here, we're going to be rolling out our web platform. It's pretty cool. It's a nice, slick dashboard.
Sounds good. I look forward to seeing it. Nick, so what's next for Bitwall after this? I mean, this is the first implementation we've seen. Do you have others already in the line, or is the idea to really focus in on this particular project and get it right and then take that model and aggregate it?
We've been definitely focused on this first implementation. Right now, we are heads down trying to get our first product out, and we're excited. I mean, working with the ZeroBlock team has been spectacular, and we're working out, as we've seen while discussions with Dan, thinking through new ideas and new ways to lower barriers to entry for someone who wants to consume content and also remove friction on the payment side. It's been spectacular. So as we said, we're gearing up to launch our first product with ZeroBlock. The next steps will follow suit shortly thereafter, but right now we're definitely heads down, building this out and making sure that users have multiple ways to engage on the platform.
So, end of the day here, if you're successful with this, what does Bitwall wind up becoming? I mean, are you an invisible company that just integrates as a platform, or are you going to wind up putting out a service out there that anybody can opt into?
Anybody can visit the website and sign up for our service. It works in two ways. So if you are a merchant or a publisher, you can access the portal and then register your company to receive access to the code we provided for them to implement on their page. And then as a consumer side, if you're consuming content on ZeroBlock, you also would be able to go to Bitwall and register for your account in order to allow you to access content across various platforms. But it's true, though. At the end of the day, we are trying to obfuscate ourselves from the process as well, so that people, when they're on ZeroBlock, that's a ZeroBlock experience. We don't necessarily want to be intruding in that. So.
Last question. What's the monetization model for Bitwall? Or are you not really focused on that part of it right now, more focused on the functionality?
Ultimately, the revenue model, I don't know the exact numbers behind it just yet. So we're still figuring out what percentage we're going to take, but we would take either a percentage of the fee or we would charge a subscription model. So essentially, people who are using the product would pay a subscription to use it.
It's very exciting work you guys are doing. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this continues to develop, and thank you for coming on the show to talk about it today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Let's Talk Bitcoin is heard each week by thousands of people who are participating in the new digital economy. Our listener base of Bitcoin owners, miners, investors, technologists, and merchants is growing fast. We offer a limited number of short advertising slots in each show to keep our listeners engaged and to provide maximum impact for our sponsors. If you'd like to talk to us about Let's Talk Bitcoin, send us an email at sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news. It's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.
This has not been the year to be in the exchange business. Just as we've seen anti-money laundering laws, know your customer, KYC rules, there are actually a whole raft of additional regulations that are about to come into play. The crypto community has received FinCEN's guidance and public statements on virtual currencies as reassuring forms of legitimization, collectively as a stamp of approval of sorts, and is certainly relieved that things have so far not gotten worse. However, as Bitcoiners are learning, being labeled a money transmitter is a rather heavy load to carry. It has already undermined one of Bitcoin's primary features, anonymity, and it may soon get worse. I say may because the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, has not yet publicly confirmed whether and to what extent implementation of Regulation E by money transmitters, known as the Remittance Transfer Rule, will be applicable to virtual currency providers as well. However, as long as the US government continues to equate convertible virtual currency operators to money transmitters, I suspect it will. Jumping ahead, as of October 28, 2013, all money transmitters will have to comply with remittance transfer rules and implement measures that largely overlap with the ones currently in force at a state level. There are a number of these obligations, but the primary one that concerns us here is Condition F, providing for 30 minutes and sometimes more for a consumer to cancel a transfer, during which time the consumer can get their money back if they cancel. This is something that only will apply to legitimate Bitcoin exchanges. The OTC market won't have to do this. Local Bitcoins won't have to do this. So again, it's another layer of burden being applied to these exchanges. And the concern here is that in order to implement this, it means that you either can trade with a minimum lag time of 30 minutes, which of course seems like it'll encourage gaming of the exchange system, because if you can place an order now but then have 30 minutes to cancel it, then you basically get to watch for the next 29 minutes, see if the trade goes your way. If it does, you go with it. If it doesn't, you just cancel it and it's no loss to you. So you have a situation you can win, but when you can't really lose. Do you guys think that this is something that can be implemented on the exchanges? Is this like another nail in the coffin, or does this not matter?
Oh, I'm pretty sure they'll try to bend over backwards to comply with this because they're scared, of the regulators. Not that I blame them for that, but I'm sure the legacy banking system absolutely loves this, because this can take away some of the competitive edge of Bitcoin. And this is one of the pressure points that exists in the Bitcoin, ecosystem that regulatory pressure can be applied to, which is the exchanges. I mean, I don't really have a great solution to it, except maybe moving away from the centralized exchanges, or perhaps there'll be massive non-compliance and it just won't be able to be enforced. I'm not exactly sure.
Or this only applies to U.S. exchanges because, well, it does.
Oh, so then there'll be no U.S. exchanges.
So there'll be no U.S. exchanges. I mean, this is really, to me, indicative of the complete lack of understanding of this medium, and also the attempt to apply kind of knee-jerk categorizations. This is just like being in 1990 and talking to telecom regulators about the internet, and they're saying, look, we're not trying to be unreasonable people here. All we're asking is that your newfangled internet network has some of the basic capabilities required by law. It must offer a dial tone. All other telecommunication networks do. It must offer ISDN and fax. All others. I don't see what the problem is here. Just offer a dial tone. So you don't understand, this is not a phone network. Well, we're going to have to play the same game and say, you don't understand, this is not a traditional payment network. If we did have to implement escrow services on the front end of exchanges, I think that would be a serious risk to network neutrality. And it would add one more nail in the coffin of US-based exchanges and push more people to local Bitcoin.
So now, are we talking about US-based exchanges? Because I was under the impression that the way the financial rules work in our world is that, Pelle Brandgaard mentioned this when we spoke last week, that if you have a single US customer, then as far as FinCEN is concerned, you fall under their guidelines and you need to comply with all of the rules for essentially the country. So is this just US exchanges, or is this any exchange that wants to ever, like Mt. Gox, for example? I think that this applies to them, given that they have so many US customers, right?
If they want to continue having U.S. customers and they're not willing to fight the U.S. regulators, yes, absolutely it does. This is really kind of trickle-down pressure, right? Because the issue isn't that the regulators can put pressure on Mt. Gox. The issue here is that the American regulators can put pressure on the Japanese regulators, who can put pressure on the Japanese banks, who do not get to deal with American banks unless they follow these rules. And then those banks can put pressure on Mt. Gox. So essentially the tentacles of the US government and financial regulatory system spread far and wide in the world. And as long as other countries are willing to give up their sovereignty in that way, they are going to be subject to these regulations. Universal jurisdiction, it's not a good thing.
So right now, the Bitcoin Foundation is sort of walking back their ambitions to try and get involved the Washington lobbying scene in a substantial way, as it kind of seemed we were moving before. It seems like this is exactly the scenario where you need something like that. Maybe it's not the Bitcoin Foundation doing it, but the need to explain this stuff to say, I'm sorry, the internet is just not a phone network, so you can't get a dial tone from it, in much the same way that you would say here, I'm sorry, Bitcoin payments are all about being irreversible and about being somewhat, pretty close to instant. So by doing this, you eliminate a lot of the advantages that the users have. I mean, is that a case that can even be made at this point? Or is it just, okay, well, if it doesn't fit into those boxes, then there's no box it fits into?
This is going to be a fight. It's not going to be an easy conversation. There are interests on both sides of this argument. And so this is going to be a protracted legal battle where precedents will be set through lawsuits. Eventually, it will settle down. I mean, it's been 15 years on the internet. We're still operating under the 1996 Telecommunications Act. We're still operating under the obsolete CALEA law enforcement access laws. We're still operating under all kinds of regulations that are completely out of date for the internet. And the end result, of course, is that what that does is it erodes the rights, privileges, and immunities of the people who use the internet because of these antiquated laws. We're going to have the exact same fight on our hands with Bitcoin. And, it's going to be an ongoing negotiation. If the U.S. ends up tying up all of the exchanges in so much regulation that they can't operate, then people will have to operate outside the U.S. and people will have to start skirting or flaunting the rules of U.S. banking institutions. Simple as that.
So you don't see any scenario where compliance with the existing rules actually is feasible in a way that doesn't significantly harm the function of these institutions?
I think that as soon as you reach that goalpost, they're going to move the goalpost at them. These rules, there is no end to these rules. There is no end to these regulations. And as we heard from interviews of the head of the National Association of Money Transmitters, for example, these rules essentially keep changing, and they always change in benefit of the incumbent. And they always put more and more barriers in the way of new entrants. The incumbents are used to playing the regulatory game, and they're willing to spend tens of millions of dollars doing fake compliance all day, all year, because that means that $10 million that they spend on fake compliance is anti-competitive money against others who can't spend it. So it's a cozy situation for them. It's not as if it's costing them their ability to commit fraud.
So we always get back to this question of, is it malice? Do they just not understand? And is there not an easy way for them to adapt their understanding to the new reality?
There is no possible way for people to absorb the rapid and disruptive change that Bitcoin brings. It upends so many assumptions, institutions, and applied processes for money that it will cause disruption, and that's inevitable. So, yeah, I don't expect people to suddenly say, have an aha moment and say, okay, oh, wait, no, I understand. Bitcoin is completely new. It's completely different. Let's rewrite the rules. Yeah, it's going to take a while, but there's no malice here. I mean, this is just institutional inertia. So much in our world today is really just institutional inertia. It's people reading the rules within a specific frame and context and then trying to apply them the best they can and ending up with completely bizarre situations.
The various problems that exchanges have been having has really had an impact on local Bitcoins. I've had a profile up there for a while, and again, there's not a lot of activity in my local area, but in the past couple of days, I've had probably 3 or 4 people contact me after a month of basically nothing before that. So, Stephanie, I know you've had some kind of similar experiences. It seems like that's a direction that this could go in. If the game plan here for the formal compliant exchanges is to essentially make them less and less functional by increasing the regulatory burden on them, then what do you think that does to a market like local Bitcoins?
It's going to be booming. I mean, that's the only thing that can happen. And then, I'm sure there'll be some attempt to crack down on local Bitcoins too after that, but it's going to be like whack-a-mole. I mean, and you really can't stop, if you as the government, they really can't stop people from trading person to person, face to face, going on Bitcoin OTC or site like Local Bitcoins. Decentralized is the way to go. It's kind of an inevitable process. Regulations are going to be ratcheted up on the exchanges. They're going to be applied bit by bit, and the exchanges are going to do their best to comply with them. They're probably not going to say no, probably not going to say, well, we can't. I mean, they may try to move, they may try to go to jurisdictions which are friendlier, but then US-based users will still have the problem that they'll want to get Bitcoins and maybe they can't get an account on an exchange that's outside of the US or something like that. So yeah, I mean, all it's going to do is just increase local Bitcoins, increase interest in people wanting to work for Bitcoins so that they don't have to deal with buying them, increase interest in mining so that people don't have to deal with buying them. Where there's a will, there's a way. If people want to get Bitcoins, they're going to get them. they're just going to have to get a little bit more creative.
I think we'll also see what this will do is it also creates market opportunities for those incumbents that do have the money to play the regulatory game with the regulators, to come at this from a completely different angle. And I'm thinking something like the Winklevoss twins Bitcoin ETF, or a mainstream bank, perhaps one of our local banks here, Silicon Valley Bank, fulfilling some of its initial movements it did with CoinLab and coming into this market as a properly regulated FDIC-insured exchange. You know, SIPC, FDIC, SEC, check all the boxes and come in and play this game. It will create some opportunities for those incumbents who can play the game to come in, and they'll have a better chance of working with the regulators because they know all the tricks of working with the regulators. I'm not worried. This thing is big enough now that there are multiple angles from which these regulations and any friction and resistance is going to be eroded.
So, Stephanie, you just described a situation that is completely decentralized, basically, and that relies on person-to-person transactions, which you can't basically stop. And Andreas, you then went on to describe a situation where, because of the regulatory burden increasingly moving forward, you have a situation where there are fewer and fewer actually compliant exchanges that get bigger and bigger because they have so much less competition. So it seems like on both sides of this issue, we have really diverted, and we're totally going to the extremes either way, no matter how this works out.
Look, there's incentives. As Stephanie said, where there's a will, there is a way. And there's incentives for people to buy Bitcoin because it's useful. So they will.
Yeah, and it's probably going to separate people. I mean, there may be a little bit of a sort of a class divide, I guess you could say, because if you have enough money to want to be investing in Bitcoins in an ETF, well, you're going to go with the Winklevosses, right? But if you want to buy Bitcoins with, 10% of your weekly paycheck, then you probably go to local Bitcoins or something like that. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. There could be this big divergence. Well, I'm up here in New Hampshire as we're recording this show. That's where I live. But I may have to take a trip to Montreal coming up pretty soon. It's not that far away for me. And that's because apparently there is going to be a Bitcoin embassy in Montreal. And they're kind of debating whether they are going to call it the Bitcoin Embassy, but that was sort of the initial name that got picked out. Somebody has donated or rented, perhaps at an attractive rate, a building that is like 3 stories high. And it's kind of like a indoor mall, I guess you could say. Some Bitcoiners in Montreal are planning to turn this into a entirely Bitcoin focused space. And so they have like a vision where when people walk in, they could have like a Bitcoin help desk where anybody could walk in and get help, like setting up a Bitcoin wallet or get their questions answered by somebody who's knowledgeable about Bitcoin. And there could be some Bitcoin related products, and there could be a way to buy and sell Bitcoins on that floor as well. And then the second floor is like a lounge that people can hang out and discuss Bitcoins or use the Wi-Fi or do their kind of maybe remote jobs. And then on the third floor, perhaps like an office space where Bitcoin startups could be doing their business. So there's all kinds of plans for this building. One of the discussions, as I mentioned a minute ago, centered around what to call this place. Some people were saying, well, embassy sounds too political, but apparently there's a law in Montreal that says the name of businesses and public places has to be in French. So they were trying to think of like a creative name that they could call it that would satisfy this requirement that would be like in French, but it would also communicate to like English speaking listeners, because most people there, do speak English. And it's basically just, as I understand, a government rule that, is trying to, quote, preserve the culture of Quebec and mandates that stuff has to be in French. Whatever they end up calling it, I think it's really exciting to have a physical space that's devoted to basically spreading the message about Bitcoin. And if there's actually a physical store in a mall or a physical place in a mall that's a Bitcoin hub, other places around there are going to take notice and they're going to say, oh, what's this Bitcoin thing? Maybe I could accept that at my store. And then pretty soon, all of Montreal is going to be like a Bitcoin economy that's booming and thriving. So I'm really excited to see how that shakes out. They seem like they're really serious about it. They're still sort of in the planning phases, but having a building is a huge deal. So I wish them luck. Maybe we could get somebody on the show to talk about that at some point.
We've been seeing this move over the last couple of years where Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general started off as this completely online phenomenon. And it was all about anonymity, and people went out of their way to hide their identities. You've got Satoshi, who, disappeared after it became obvious that the concept was at least going to get some traction. And now we've reached the point of adoption where it's moving from that virtual space and from that anonymous space into real life. And actually, these physical locations are popping up. The Satoshi Square phenomenon is basically the same thing there. Frankly, the fact that the three of us are sitting here talking about this and we're using our real names. This is exactly the sort of thing that you see as the concept moves closer towards the mainstream. It can't succeed on its own because it's too abstract. But if you start applying it to the real world and people get to see the use cases in action, whether it be us talking about it and being real, people, just like everybody else out there, as opposed to being some shadowy figures on the internet talking about subversive concepts, that has a much greater impact on the majority of people out there who look at abstract concepts and say, okay, well, what can I do with that? And now there are tangible, and I think the things that you mentioned there that they could do with this space, co-working is a huge thing that's getting to be very, very popular and quite lucrative too for the companies and for the service providers that engage in it. So even with a donated space, you can totally see how this could become a pretty self-sufficient thing, entirely operating on a Bitcoin-based economy in a relatively short period of time.
We essentially have a couple of spaces like this already here in San Francisco. There's
they mentioned those as inspiration for what they were trying to do, actually.
Right. We've got the hacker spaces that started out of Germany, out of the Chaos Computer Club, and then spread to California and other places, and then eventually all around the world. We also have in San Mateo, there's the Boost VC offices, where they have, I think, 4 or 5 Bitcoin startups at the moment. So that's a little hotbed of Bitcoin activity. I'm really excited, though, about this Montreal embassy. I would like to declare fealty to the Bitcoin nation and apply for asylum. Yes, indeed. I'm applying for asylum. And in fact, what they should do is they should have...
They should just secede. How about that?
that second floor lounge sounded kind of comfortable. They should put in some whistleblower dormitories in there.
Yeah. You could be...
Vive Montreal! Vive Montreal!
There's a lot happening in Canada right now as far as Bitcoin is concerned. It's been really interesting watching our neighbors to the north kind of have a very different experience with the regulatory environment that we've had down here. I spoke with Anthony Diorio, who now he wasn't at the time, but now he's been appointed the executive director of the Bitcoin Alliance of Canada. And, it sounds like they're getting a lot of traction and are having a lot of businesses approach them who would be doing business in the United States, except they simply don't know what the rules are going to be. And so it's very difficult to try and make some sort of commitment like that. But these are like mainstream companies who are looking at the situation in Canada and saying it has all the advantages of being in North America, but it doesn't have any of the regulatory burden. And, the hurdle there, of course, we know that the banks are still kind of having some shaky footing in terms of the types of Bitcoin companies they want to deal with. But the looming burden of regulatory compliance is not so much there for Bitcoin startups the way it is in the United States.
But they sure have a heavy burden of regulation on the actual banks. And in fact, Canada is one of the places that still has a fairly robust equivalent of Glass-Steagall and separation between investment and retail banking. As a result, in 2008, Canadian banks were solvent. Imagine that. And remain solvent throughout the entire debacle that we saw here. So the Canadians are doing things differently in more than just one way. You've got to look at this regulation from both sides. Not only how much is Bitcoin regulated, but how much of the regulation really is about protecting consumers against fraud and how much of it is about protecting incumbents against competition. In Canada, they're definitely protecting consumers. Over here, I'm not so sure.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly shows include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
EasyDNS is the Swiss Army knife for your domain names, helping meet their customers' individual needs since 1998. EasyDNS has been an outspoken critic of SOPA and CISPA. EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, and now they are proud to sponsor this show. Do business with a company that shares your values. Get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Go to bitcoin.easydns.com and be sure to use discount code LTB.
In a really early episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin, we spoke with Daryl, who was a customer at Bitfloor. He shared with us his experience going through some rough times there and how he had some money tied up in it. He's not the only situation where that's happened. There's a company that was around some time back called InstaWallet. It was one of the online wallet services. And here we are, a fair amount of time after some bad things happened there and some people are still trying to get their money back. This morning, I'm joined by James. James, can you tell us what happened with InstaWallet?
Yeah, I mean, from what we were told when we finally found out there was a problem was the website went offline. There was like a front page warning just saying simply, there's a problem, there's some funds have been taken. Please wait. This was over Easter weekend, I think. So this was April the 1st. And obviously, everyone who had money in there, it was a pretty difficult to know what was going on and a worrying time for everyone, I think. After that, there was a few days wait before there was any updates. And then the update was that the money had been stolen. Somehow their systems had been compromised. And again, more of a kind of wait and see what's going to happen. Eventually, they put out a claims process. They said there'll be a claims process which will take 90 days. So that was probably about 8, 9, 10 days after the whole thing had happened. And I mean, that was one of the worst weeks of my life. Yeah, for some financial reasons, yeah.
So let's back up for a second. Can you tell me what is InstaWallet and why is it a service that you were using at the time?
Well, I got into Bitcoin, I suppose, 2012. The price of Bitcoins were about £3 each, and I had a few. I'd read about Bitcoin and thought I want to buy some, and I bought some, and I made a pretty serious investment, I suppose, at the time. But basically, it was the first thing that I kind of found as a way of keeping hold of Bitcoins. And obviously, looking back now in hindsight, I realized that it was the wrong thing to keep that many Bitcoins in. For example, I had one wallet with 200 Bitcoins in, but I actually lost that wallet. The way that the InstaWallet works was every time you go to instawallet.org, it regenerated a unique wallet URL. So it would have like a 25, 30-digit random character thing after instawallet.org / all these random characters, and that was your private wallet address. And I believed, as it said, was that if you don't lose that address, then your money is safe. If you do lose it, there is nothing they can do. That was the warning on the site. There was, if you lose this URL, there is nothing you can do. So at the time, I lost this wallet with 200 Bitcoins in, which at the time was about 600 quid. And obviously, I was gutted, but not quite as gutted as I was when I saw the price kept going up and up and up.
Yeah, wow, that's terrible. So now this happened earlier this year, right?
It was April the 1st, over the Easter weekend, that the compromise happened. The forums obviously were on fire. There was a lot of people, a lot of angry people as well. There didn't seem to be much communication from InstaWallet, and there was a lot of people shouting scams and, suggesting that they'd run off with the money. It was an inside job. I mean, nobody really knew anything. That was the thing. I mean, it was all just hearsay. It was all just speculation. But obviously, there'd been other problems with various companies that people kind of latched onto, and there was a point when I thought that there was no chance I was going to get any of my money back. I really, and it was a substantial amount, and it was, like I say, it was a tough time.
We're months after that's happened. You said that they gave a 90-day window where payouts were going to happen. It sounds like that didn't occur. Can you bring us up to date on where we are now?
Well, what they did, I think it was on the 11th of April, they said this is the way it's going to work. They're going to start a claims process. This is going to be a 90-day claims process. And in that time, you're going to be able to visit your URL. So you go back to your private URL, and it will show you how many Bitcoins you had in there. You then put your details. You basically say that this is my wallet address. This is what I want the money to be sent to. And you basically claim for that money. What they said was that if there was a duplicate claim, they would have to work out who it's going to be, because if there was a hacker who had access to all the private URLs, I think they were expecting some duplicate claims to come in. Now, what they said was anything under 50 Bitcoins in a wallet would be paid back, no problem. If there was duplicate claims, that I think the first person to claim would be the one that got the wallet. Anything over 50 would be dealt with on a case-by-case and best efforts basis. Now, that was the thing that worried everyone. And I think for me personally, because most of my wallets were larger than 50, it was like, well, that doesn't seem very fair. If you've lost money, if say you've lost 50% of everyone's money, surely everybody should take a 50% hit, right, rather than paying out the smaller ones and then the big ones have to suffer. But now, so now the situation is that it's reached the end of that claim process. There was a bit of a problem on July the 1st because they put that July the 1st was the end, but then it got to July the 1st and they were like, actually, we did say 90 days, and that was on the April the 11th, 11 days after the actual hack. So we waited another 11 days, and then since then, what's happened is they said, okay, go back into your wallets. The amount that you'll be getting paid is there. Confirm that amount. So if you're signing off that amount, last kind of check, I suppose, last time to make sure there's no mistakes. And then the money will be paid out on Friday. Is it the 19th, tomorrow, Friday the 19th? And that's apparently the day that we're going to get our money back. And I mean, fortunately, so far, all the big wallets as well, all the ones over 50, they've also agreed to pay those back. I've got a couple of different wallets that have got other issues, which they're working on, I believe, but all the ones that had just had no issues, I didn't have any duplicate claims. It all went through fine. And it looks like, fingers crossed, tomorrow's the day when they'll return the money.
That sounds like, all things considered, this is not a tremendously bad outcome. So what have you taken away from this experience? What's been what have you learned from this ordeal that you've undertaken? Do you think there's an inherent problem here with any of these technologies, or is it just a site that got unlucky?
I'm not technologically minded that much, but I realise that InstaWallet must have a place. And from what I understand, talking to some of the developers and the guys behind it, they are planning on relaunching it in another way. Like blockchain.info, which I use sometimes for small amounts. It does have a place in the economy, I would have thought, but everything I have is now a paper wallet, and I've just ordered from Andreas a pack of paper wallets as well to go because they look so interesting. But I think that's got to be the way. If you've got any substantial amount of money, it's got to be kept in cold storage. It's got to be trusting it with an online wallet. I mean, it's not the developers, and if not, even if you inherently trust everybody that's on there, you've got the risk of hacking. You've got all the problems. Looking back now as well, I mean, the guys behind InstaWallet, the way they've done it, even though they were getting shouted down so much at the start, I think that someone else was mentioned on the forum just recently as well. If they do pay everything back, then really, when you look back at the process they've had to deal with, which is possibly handing out millions of pounds back to people who pretty much anonymous all over the world, 90 days really was not too bad, to be honest, to do that, make sure there's no mistakes. Because obviously, if they give the Bitcoins back to the wrong person, then there's going to be serious trouble because obviously it's irreversible. So they've got to make sure that what they do is done right. All credit to them. Other than maybe slight lacks of communication sometimes at certain points of the process where maybe a little bit more, customer-friendly communication would have been appreciated at the time, I don't think really you can fault them. If the money comes back, they'll have done a very good job.
Thank you for sharing this with us, James. I think that this is, these stories are interesting when they come out, and they're painful, certainly, for the people who are involved. But I really think that there are lessons to be learned to share in the experience with other people in the community so that they can be more skeptical moving forward and at least have some of this experience, under their belt too.
For sure. I mean, the one more thing I wanted to say that you mentioned in one of the more recent episodes that I listened to, and that's just there needs to be something for the beginner, something for the beginner, which is still easy for them to get into, but still secure. Because when you first look into it, Bitcoin.qt is still quite complicated. And I'm sure there are teams working on it to make that whole thing more customer friendly, more client friendly, and just having the security level locked in right at the start, because the online wallets do just seem to be the easiest way to kind of get someone involved in Bitcoin first of all. And that's obviously what we want to do. We want to grow the community and get everyone involved.
That's the hope here, is that regardless of how we get there, these problems get fixed, and that companies emerge and that products emerge that actually fix these problems and make it so it can just be an easy thing while still not sacrificing that security, like you mentioned. I think that is absolutely what needs to happen, and it will happen eventually, and it's situations like this that'll cause it.
Lovely.
James, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming on the show to share your experience.
No problem at all, and keep up the good work, yeah?
I really appreciate James speaking to me about his experience with InstaWallet. We recorded that right before they were set to pay out. I know that you had some accounts with InstaWallet too. How did that go? Were you able to get your money out?
Yeah, I had one InstaWallet, and at the time when they experienced the hack, I only had about 0.125 Bitcoins in there, so it wasn't very much. But I filed a claim to try to get it back in April, and they said that they would start processing the refunds, I think, in July. I didn't know this, but I thought I was all set because I had made the claim. I had said, how much was in this wallet and would like it back and please pay it out to this address. Well, what I didn't know was that you actually had to revisit the wallet URL page. It would just be the same page that you had your wallet on when InstaWallet was operating. You had to revisit it, and then you had to like approve the payout. And once you said, yes, I want this payout, then they would actually pay you. And they did, a couple days later after I did that. But the thing that I didn't know was you actually had to go back to that URL after the claim was filed and say, yes, I still want it. So, they've made it a little bit tricky, but you can apparently still get your money back if you know to do that. So just a PSA.
Now, one thing that I didn't ask him, and I'm curious if you know, do you know where this money's coming from? Because if they were hacked and the money was supposedly taken, I mean, are the people who ran InstaWallet actually paying this out of pocket, or did they get the money back?
I don't know where it came from. I don't care. I got my money back, so I'll take it wherever it came from. But yeah, I don't think they got it back, because I think we would have heard about that, right? If there was a high profile kind of theft that got solved. I didn't even hear anything about any sort of forensic work that was done to determine where the money went. Did you guys hear anything about that?
No, I didn't. And that's kind of what's interesting about this whole thing is that it seems like, for the people who were affected by it, this was a big deal. But for the people who weren't affected by it, there really wasn't too much to it. And, again, it's sort of surprising to see that when these thefts happen, people aren't broadcasting the addresses that they went to all over the place. It seems like that would kind of be the standard practice.
In the olden days of Bitcoin back in 2011, when the high profile hacks would happen, like I think TradeHill, there were posts all over the internet saying, okay, it went to this address and this address and this address, and then from there to these addresses. It was like, okay, if you ever see these addresses again, let us know. It was publicizing it, but I didn't see any of that with this InstaWallet.
I think there's a big risk in trying to implement safety recourses and solutions to these types of thefts, because there's an instinctive need to do something about it, right? To make sure this can't happen. And that instinctive need for safety leads to poor security decisions, and I think decisions that may be poor for the long-term success and survivability of Bitcoin. So we already saw some of the knee-jerk reactions that regulators have imposed with the idea of putting delays, right? So you can recover the money after a while. That would help solve a lot of fraud problems in Bitcoin, but it would break a very important underlying principle. I think similarly, tracking coins and tracking addresses and then putting in place potentially filters to say don't spend money from these coins creates an extremely dangerous precedent that breaks Bitcoin neutrality and then opens that technology up, the potential technology of filtering by address or tracking addresses or scoring addresses, etc. That power will be used, and it won't be used to protect against theft. I can guarantee you that.
So your concern is that this is a slippery slope, and that even because we're not talking about setting up systems here. We're talking about the fact that if there's a theft and you know where the money goes, then it makes sense to say, hey, the money went here. So your concern is that by even going down that path at all, you inevitably wind up with a situation where you can continue justifying continued action in that way until you have systems set up where essentially you're checking every transaction that goes through an exchange or various other checkpoints and that's the point, is that you have checkpoints now where you're actually looking for these specific addresses that are, identified as bad actors for whatever reason.
Yeah, and you go from actors who are bad towards the Bitcoin community to actors who are bad towards the center of power to actors who are dissidents towards the center of power to banning WikiLeaks, in 5 easy steps. And you're right back to Visa not accepting payments for WikiLeaks, and you end up with a situation where Bitcoin payments to WikiLeaks can be blocked because once you put that control point to the network, someone will regulate it, legislate it, and then use it for their own power accumulation.
So, well, then what do you do in the case of a theft? What is the correct way that doesn't endanger the entire network over the long term? Is just to say, okay, well, you got it, so bye. Thanks for playing.
Maybe prevention is the only real solution.
Yeah, prevention and punishment. There's nothing that says you can't go after, and if you manage to discover who these people are, claw it back, just like we saw with Pirates at 40, right? In that case, the identity was a bit more obvious. So I'm not saying don't enforce. I think, Stephanie, you're absolutely right. Prevention, the idea that you have caveat emptor turned on all times, that this is a fundamentally different currency where there is no nanny state to come and save you if you mess up with your money and you make bad choices. I think that's a healthy attitude. The risk of losing your money if you do business with people who don't take security seriously enough is a good thing. And if you remove that risk by implementing things in the protocol, what you end up is with rules and regulations that protect incumbents, not you.
So we have a set of proposed, quote, improvements to the Bitcoin protocol coming up over the next, I guess, 6 months, some of which do things like this, some of which do kind of start down that path, that slippery slope, moving towards more control and more ability to filter between different types of users, basically, ones that are okay versus ones that aren't. We definitely should talk about that on a future show. I mean, do you think that if we did go down that path, what do you think the community response would be? You know, I mean, do you think that this would be something that would be viewed broadly as a good thing? Or do you think that people would recognize that it, in fact, has all of these negative repercussions once you play out the logic long enough?
No, I think people would be pretty skeptical of it and would probably quickly make the connection like Andreas did of, hey, you know, if we can color or taint certain coins, then perhaps that could be used in ways that aren't very conducive to freedom and frankly aren't really Bitcoin, you know, and undermine this very fundamental principle. One thing that has not been mentioned so far in this discussion is the idea of insurance, which I think would be really interesting. And, you know, perhaps there is some kind of Bitcoin insurance against hacks and so forth, but I'm not aware of it. I was just thinking, you know, if Mt. Gox, if InstaWallet, and I'm sure Mt. Gox might have a pretty high premium because they get a lot of trouble. You know, if some of these organizations had insurance that said, okay, you know, we'll pay this many Bitcoins per month if you insure us against some disaster where there's a major hack and all of our Bitcoins are stolen. And then in turn, the insurance company would sort of have the effect of really checking into the security measures that were being taken by the company that they're insuring to prevent theft. And so they would have an incentive to have strong anti-theft measures and have better security on their back end or whatever for a lower premium. Then I think that would help solve a lot of problems. That would be a great preventative measure. But I don't know if anything like that exists. Maybe there's a market opportunity for that.
There certainly is insurance against hacking. It's something that's developed over the last decade. It started off with Lloyd's of London, which is a well-known insurance company that offers kind of creative insurance schemes that haven't been done before, and gradually spread. And at the moment, there's 2 or 3 providers here in the US, at least, mostly reinsurance companies. They have a name that ends in re. Those companies tend to offer hacking insurance for specific premiums. So yeah, I think that's a really good market-based solution for this problem. However, I don't share your confidence that people will extrapolate these small control interactions and this, we could all be a bit safer if we gave up a tiny bit of liberty here to gain more security in the Bitcoin protocol. Unfortunately, I've seen that equation play out in real life too many times, and almost always people go for the safety instead of the freedom, and they don't really see the long-term implications of making protocol changes like this.
But even if it's the Bitcoin community where they're naturally right now, the early adopters are like really skeptical, kind of libertarian-ish, you don't think that they would be a different kind of crowd?
I hope so. And that's really the big danger, I think, of mainstream adoption, is that as you have mainstream adoption, you erode the principles that got us here in the first place, and you start going down a different path, which is why you need these principles very well baked in advance. I'm worried that some of these changes will go through with not too much discussion, but more importantly, I'm worried about the vote. Because at the end of the day, if the client, the Satoshi reference client 09, has an NSA backdoor in it, or whatever, just to go to the completely extreme situation, just for fun, then essentially people would end up voting by choosing whether they would run the 0.83 or the 0.9 client and cause a hard fork, and then pick the blockchain that represents their ideology. Now, that's what would happen if mining was distributed among all the users of Bitcoin. But in this particular case, that decision will be made almost entirely by those who have ASIC miners. And so you're essentially concentrating the consensus decision in the hands of people who have different incentives from the average Bitcoin user, which is why I think this is dangerous.
Do you think that there could be a situation where you have a fork and they don't resolve? You have one fork go one way with part of the network and another fork go another way with part of the network, never again to meet, you know, with slightly different rules in each one?
That's certainly possible. I don't see why not. Just to explain to our audience, you would then have Bitcoin in both chains. And essentially the value of that Bitcoin would diverge, especially if there was limited trading between them. And over time, one would become dominant over the other. Who knows which one? Just like a software fork, this would result in fragmentation of the space and would probably be damaging to the network effects and overall growth of the platform. But if you have a very controversial feature choice, then that's exactly what should happen. That's the design of the Bitcoin network, is to do exactly that, to break down the consensus line and, if necessary, fork into two different networks. You see, the thing is, it's a very, very difficult proposition to do that because there is an enormous amount of inertia and network effect behind Bitcoin as is today. So essentially, if you are part of the core dev team, you can change the core Bitcoin network and use that inertia, making sure that people will follow you over that change. But if you're not part of the core dev team and you disagree with those changes, overcoming them is much, much more difficult because you don't have the network effect on your side.
Changes to the Satoshi client, I don't always update immediately. It seems like that, there's some momentum on the side.
But you're not a miner. And that's the bottom line. So whether you upgrade or not, nobody cares because you don't have the hashing power. You're not part of the voting population.
This is a good point.
I mean, that's the main point, that unless you have hashing power and significant amounts of hashing power, you have no vote. Who cares if you upgrade or not? Code will be run based on the rules of whatever code the miners are running, not whatever code the clients are running.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Bitcoin. If you'd like to contribute topics, questions, or comments, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com/Reddit. We're going to try and use this as much as possible, and submissions with more upvotes from other listeners will make it onto the show much faster than sending an email. Thanks to everyone who provided content or music for this episode. And thanks to you, the listener, for listening. See you next time.